In the glittering heart of Los Angeles, an arrogant chef's cruel dismissal of a homeless veteran sparks a dramatic chain of events when none other than Billie Eilish steps into the picture. What happens when the tables turn and the chef is forced to confront his actions in front of the world? Will this moment of reckoning change his heart or destroy everything he's built? Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking tales. Ethan Carr slammed the plate down on the stainless steel counter, his frustration palpable as he barked, "Do it again. And this time, don't embarrass me." The line cooks exchanged nervous glances, each of them hyper-aware of their boss's boiling temper. The restaurant was packed, the hum of conversation from the dining area barely masking the chaos in the kitchen. To Ethan, perfection wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. Anything less, and you didn't belong. The gleaming kitchen was his kingdom, the pristine white tiles reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. Every station hummed with activity, from the sizzling pans at the sauté station to the rhythmic chopping at the prep counter. Ethan thrived in the intensity, the controlled chaos, but his tolerance for mistakes was non-existent. He was a culinary genius, sure, but his genius came at the cost of humanity. Ethan, table 12, sent their compliments on the truffle risotto. Sarah, the head server, reported as she hesitated by the pass. She braced herself for his usual dismissive response. He waved a hand without looking up. Of course they did. It's the best they've ever had. Now get out of my way. The staff obeyed without question. No one dared challenge Ethan, even when his sharp tongue cut deep or his outburst left them questioning why they stayed. Working at Carr, Ethan's Michelin-starred restaurant, was a privilege. But it was also a test of endurance, one many didn't pass. Out in the dining area, the restaurant exuded luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over impeccably set tables, each adorned with fine china and perfectly folded napkins. The air buzzed with the murmurs of the elite, couples in designer clothes savoring Ethan's masterpieces and Instagramming their plates before taking a bite. This was Ethan's world, a curated space where he controlled everything. Until the door opened, and the first crack appeared in his polished veneer. The man who entered didn't belong. Dressed in a tattered army jacket, jeans worn to threads, and boots that had seen better days, he stood out like a sore thumb. His hair was unkempt, his face lined with exhaustion. Mike Harper didn't need to be told he wasn't welcome. He could feel the stares from the patrons and the disdain from the hostess who hesitated before approaching him. "I just need something to eat," Mike said, his voice low but steady. The hostess, uncomfortable, glanced toward the kitchen door. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this restaurant is." "What's going on here?" Ethan's voice cut through the dining room as he emerged from the kitchen. His tall, imposing frame and chef's whites commanded attention. The room fell silent, forks pausing mid-air as the diners watched the scene unfold. Ethan's sharp gaze landed on Mike, taking in every detail of his appearance. The chef's lips curled in disgust. "This isn't a soup kitchen," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mike stood his ground, though his hands tightened into fists at his sides. "I'm not asking for charity, just something warm, and I'll pay you back when I can." Ethan scoffed. "Pay me back? Do you even know where you are?" He gestured dramatically to the opulent surroundings, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is Care, not some greasy diner off the highway." A few diners exchanged uneasy looks, but no one intervened. Mike's face reddened, and he shifted awkwardly under the weight of Ethan's scorn. Sarah, watching from the kitchen door, felt a pang of guilt. She had served veterans at shelters before, and could see the quiet dignity in the man's eyes, despite his appearance. "Ethan, maybe we can," she began, but Ethan silenced her with a glare. "Not another word, Sarah. I run this restaurant, and I won't have it turned into a sideshow." He turned back to Mike. "Get out before I call the police." Mike hesitated, his pride warring with his hunger. Finally, he nodded, muttered a quiet, "I'm sorry for bothering you," and turned to leave. The door closed behind him, and the tension in the room broke like a snapped string. The diners returned to their conversations, some whispering about what had just happened, others deliberately ignoring it. Ethan, satisfied, strode back into the kitchen as though nothing had happened. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her heart heavy. She glanced toward the door where Mike had exited and then back to Ethan, who was already barking orders at the line cooks. This wasn't the first time Ethan's arrogance had made her question her place here, but tonight it felt different. Something about the way Mike had walked out, head held high despite the humiliation, stuck with her. Out in the cold, Mike sat on the curb across the street, the warm glow of the restaurant mocking him. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and sighed. Tonight was just another reminder of how far he had fallen. Back inside, Ethan continued his tirade, oblivious to the fact that his perfect world was about to be upended in a way he could never have imagined. Mike Harper sat on the cold, cracked sidewalk, his back against a building across the street from Carr. His hands trembled as he cradled a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee he'd bought with the last of his change. The bitter liquid did little to fill the ache in his stomach or the hollow feeling in his chest. From where he sat, he could still see the soft glow of the restaurant sign, its golden lettering mocking him, a symbol of everything that was now out of reach. His reflection shimmered in a puddle on the pavement, distorted but familiar enough to make him wince. The weathered man staring back at him didn't resemble the clean-cut soldier he once was. His mind drifted back to a time when his uniform was pressed, his boots polished, and his head filled with purpose. Back then, people had saluted him, thanked him for his service, even bought him meals out of gratitude. Now he was invisible, or worse, seen as a nuisance. The distant sound of laughter from inside the restaurant carried across the street, cutting through the night's quiet. Mike lowered his head, memories flooding in. Years ago, Mike had been part of an elite unit in the military, stationed overseas. He'd served with pride, wearing his country's flag on his sleeve. He could still hear the roar of helicopters overhead, the sharp commands over the radio, and the camaraderie of his squad. It was dangerous work, but he believed in it. He believed in serving, protecting, and standing for something bigger than himself. But belief didn't shield him from the reality of war. One mission in particular haunted him, a convoy ambush in the unforgiving heat of the desert. Explosions had erupted around them, throwing the convoy into chaos. Mike remembered the deafening sound of mortar shells and the acrid smell of smoke and burning rubber. He'd been knocked unconscious and awoke to a scene of carnage. Friends he'd trained with, laughed with, and trusted with his life were gone in an instant. The physical scars from that day had healed, but the mental ones never did. When Mike returned home, he brought the war with him. Nightmares, flashbacks, and a sense of survivor's guilt followed him like a shadow. Despite therapy and medication, he couldn't hold down a job or maintain relationships. His family, though initially supportive, grew distant when they couldn't understand why he couldn't just move on. Eventually, the pieces of his life fell away, one by one, until he found himself where he was now alone, forgotten, and fighting just to survive another day. A soft voice broke his reverie. "Hey, are you okay?" Mike looked up to see Sarah standing there, a to-go box in her hands. She pulled her jacket tight against the evening chill, her breath visible in the cold air. Her nervous smile betrayed her unease, but there was kindness in her eyes. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, holding the box out toward him. Mike hesitated, pride and hunger waging a silent battle inside him. Finally, he nodded and reached for the box. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. He opened it to find a small but generous portion of food, certainly more than she was supposed to give away. Sarah sat down on the curb a few feet away from him, her knees pulled to her chest. "I'm sorry about earlier, Ethan. He's just like that." Mike nodded, taking a cautious bite of the food. The warmth spread through him like a balm. "It's not your fault," he said between bites. "I've dealt with worse." She tilted her head, curious. "You were in the military, weren't you?" Mike paused, swallowing hard. "Yeah, a long time ago." "I thought so. My dad served too." Vietnam. Sarah's voice softened. He didn't talk about it much, but when he did, I could tell it changed him. Mike gave a faint smile. "It changes all of us. Some handle it better than others." The two sat in silence for a moment, the distant hum of the city filling the space between them. Sarah broke it first. "You deserve better, you know. Someone like you shouldn't be treated like that." Mike shook his head. "It's not about what I deserve. Life's just complicated. People see what they want to see." "Doesn't mean it's right," Sarah countered. She glanced back at the restaurant. Ethan thinks he's untouchable, but he's not. What he did tonight, it's going to stick with me. Mike looked at her, seeing the conflict in her expression. You don't have to put yourself on the line for me. Sarah sighed. Maybe not, but someone has to. As she stood to leave, she hesitated. Take care of yourself, okay? Mike nodded, watching as she crossed the street and disappeared back into the warmth of the restaurant. He finished the food, savoring every bite, but his thoughts lingered on her words. He didn't know why she'd taken the risk, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Inside the restaurant, Sarah returned to her station, avoiding Ethan's gaze. She didn't regret helping Mike, but she knew she'd pay for it if Ethan found out. As the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's events were just the beginning of something much bigger. The restaurant had just started to wind down for the evening. The ambient hum of conversation softened, and the clinking of silverware was less frequent as diners savored their desserts. Ethan stood at the kitchen pass, arms crossed, surveying his domain like a hawk. He relished moments like these when everything seemed flawless, when the chaos of earlier hours gave way to the serene satisfaction of excellence. Table 4's souffle is undercooked. Fix it, he snapped, his voice cutting through the soft chatter in the kitchen. Perfection, after all, was not negotiable. The quiet routine of the night shattered when the restaurant's front door opened, the chime ringing out in stark contrast to the refined atmosphere. Heads turned, and a ripple of murmurs spread across the dining room. A young woman, dressed in an oversized hoodie and baggy pants, walked in. Despite her casual attire, there was no mistaking her identity: Billie Eilish. The hostess froze, her eyes wide. "A welcome to Carr," she stammered, nearly dropping the menus in her hands. "Thanks," Billie said casually, her voice low and easy. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the polished tables, the chandeliers, and the carefully curated crowd. But her relaxed demeanor shifted as her eyes landed on the figure sitting outside on the curb. Through the window, a man hunched over, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the world. Her expression tightened, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Is that man okay?" Billie asked, nodding toward Mike. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority to it. The hostess hesitated, unsure how to respond. I think he's just..." Resting, her tone was tinged with discomfort. Before she could say anything further, Ethan appeared, his usual briskness amplified by his annoyance. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze moving from Billie to the flustered hostess. Then he noticed who the guest was. Ethan's expression transformed in an instant, his irritation melting into a practiced charm. "Ah, Ms. Eilish, welcome to Carr. It's an honor to have you here tonight. Your table is ready." Billie didn't move. Instead, she fixed Ethan with a level stare, ignoring his outstretched hand. "What's going on with the guy outside?" Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Oh, him? He's no one. Just a homeless guy who wandered in earlier." "Don't worry, I handled it." "Handled it?" Billie echoed, her voice now tinged with steel. "What does that mean?" "It means I told him this isn't the place for people like him," Ethan replied, his tone dismissive. "This is a high-end establishment, not a charity." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Diners whispered to one another, their eyes darting between Billie and Ethan. Sarah, standing near the kitchen door, watched the exchange with a mix of apprehension and admiration. She'd seen Ethan's arrogance before, but she'd never seen anyone challenge him so directly. Billie took a step closer to Ethan, her voice calm but unyielding. "You kicked out a veteran who served this country because he didn't meet your standards? That's what you call handling it." Ethan's face flushed. "I run a business, Ms. Eilish. My guests come here for a certain atmosphere. If I let people like that in, it undermines everything I've built." "What you've built?" Billie's voice rose slightly, her incredulity clear. "You think this place is special because of your chandeliers and overpriced souffles? Let me tell you something: what makes a place truly special is the way it treats people, not how much money they have." Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but Billie didn't give him the chance. She turned to the hostess. "Get me a table for two, near the window." The hostess hesitated, glancing nervously at Ethan. "Of course, Ms. Eilish." Before taking her seat, Billy walked toward the door. Everyone in the restaurant watched as she stepped outside and crouched next to Mike. She gently touched his shoulder, her voice soft. "Hey, are you okay?" Mike looked up, startled. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, embarrassed. "I'm fine," he mumbled. "You don't need to worry about me." "I think I do," Billy said, her tone gentle but insistent. "Come on, you're eating with me." Mike blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What?" "You heard me," she smiled, standing up and offering her hand. "Let's go." Mike hesitated. He didn't want charity, but there was something in her eyes, kindness maybe, or determination that made him believe this wasn't about pity. Slowly, he took her hand and allowed her to lead him inside. The room fell silent as Billy and Mike walked to the table. Patrons stared, their curiosity mixed with discomfort. Billy pulled out a chair for Mike and sat across from him, unfazed by the attention. Ethan approached, his composure visibly shaken. "Ms. Elish, if you'd like, I can have your meal served privately." "No," Billy interrupted, her voice firm. "We're fine here." Sarah seized the moment. She quickly grabbed menus and approached the table, setting them down with a quiet smile. "What can I get for you two?" "I'll have whatever you recommend," Billy said, glancing at Mike. "And for my friend here, make sure he gets the best meal this place has to offer." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. "Right away." As the kitchen erupted into a flurry of activity, Ethan retreated, his confidence visibly cracked. At her table, Billy leaned forward, speaking quietly to Mike, who began to relax, the weight of his day momentarily lifting. Across the restaurant, Sarah couldn't help but smile. Tonight was different, she thought. Tonight someone had finally stood up to Ethan Carr, and she had a feeling this was only the beginning. The dining room of Carr was unnervingly quiet, the air thick with tension. Diners whispered behind raised hands, some daring to steal glances at Billie Eilish and the homeless veteran now seated at the table near the window. Others pretended not to notice, though their stiff postures betrayed their unease. The golden glow of the chandeliers seemed harsher now, illuminating not just the opulent room but the undercurrent of judgment that had seeped in. Ethan Carr stood near the kitchen, his jaw clenched and his fists balled tightly at his sides. His carefully constructed empire, his reputation as the uncompromising master of this elite establishment, was unraveling in real time. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, not on Billy, but on him. "Sarah," Ethan hissed through gritted teeth as she passed with 2 steaming plates. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She stopped but didn't turn to face him, keeping her focus on the table ahead. "I'm doing my job, Ethan. Isn't that what you pay me for?" Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she approached Billy and Mike's table. She placed the plates down carefully, a truffle-infused filet mignon for Billy and an exquisitely plated sea bass for Mike, both dishes more suited to a Michelin-starred restaurant than a homeless shelter. "Enjoy," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Mike for a brief moment. He nodded in gratitude, his expression still wary, as if he couldn't quite believe he was sitting in this gilded room. Billy picked up her fork and gestured to Mike. "Eat," she said with a smile. "Trust me, it's better hot." Mike hesitated, looking around the room. He could feel the judgment from every direction, the unspoken question of why someone like him was there. But when his eyes met Billy's, there was no pity, only encouragement. Slowly, he picked up his fork and took a bite. From across the room, a well-dressed woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made him chuckle. Mike saw it and stiffened, the bite of food suddenly tasting like ash. Billy noticed too. She set her fork down deliberately and turned to face the room. "Something funny?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to make heads turn. The man's smile faltered. "Oh no, not at all," he stammered, his face flushing. The woman beside him looked down, clearly embarrassed. "Good," Billy said simply, returning to her meal. The exchange left a ripple of awkwardness, but it also set a precedent no one else dared to comment. The tension reached its peak when Billy pulled out her phone. Ethan watched, his unease growing as she tapped the screen. He wasn't sure what she was doing, but he doubted it would end well for him. "Mike," Billy said, looking up, "do you mind if I share your story?" Mike froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. I don't know, I'm not really looking for attention. It's not about attention, Billy explained. It's about showing people what matters. I think your story could do that. He studied her for a moment, her sincerity evident. After a pause, he nodded. Okay. Billy smiled, then hit record. This is Mike Harper, she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. He's a veteran who served this country with honor. Tonight, he came here looking for a meal and a little warmth. Instead, he was humiliated and turned away. Ethan's heart sank as her words echoed through the dining room. Several diners set down their utensils, their faces registering a mix of guilt and discomfort. But here's the thing, Billy continued. Mike's story isn't unique. There are thousands of people just like him, people who've given so much and gotten so little in return. It's time we start seeing them, really seeing them. She stopped the recording and looked at Mike. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice breaking just a little. Mike nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. Meanwhile, Ethan was spiraling. He stormed into the kitchen, his staff scattering like leaves in the wind. This is a disaster, he hissed, pacing. Do you realize what she's doing to my reputation? Maybe it's about time someone did, Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with defiance. You can't keep treating people like they're beneath you, Ethan. It's wrong. Ethan rounded on her. Don't you dare lecture me in my own restaurant. You have no idea what it takes to build something like this. And you have no idea what it means to have compassion, she shot back. This isn't just your restaurant, Ethan. It's where we work. It's where people come to celebrate, to connect. If you can't see that, maybe you don't deserve it. Ethan glared at her, but he didn't respond. Deep down, her words hit a nerve he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Back in the dining room, Billy's post had already begun gaining traction. Notifications lit up her phone as comments and shares flooded in. Some of the diners, now understanding the gravity of the situation, approached the table to shake Mike's hand or quietly thank him for his service. For the first time in years, Mike felt seen not as a burden or a failure, but as a person. It was overwhelming, but also deeply healing. As the night wore on, Ethan stayed in the kitchen, too proud or perhaps too ashamed to face the fallout. He knew his carefully cultivated image would never be the same, but what he didn't yet understand was how much better it could be if he allowed himself to change. The morning after the explosive events at Carr, Ethan Carr awoke to chaos. His phone buzzed incessantly, a stream of notifications that blurred together as he groggily scrolled through them. Social media was ablaze. Billie Eilish's video had gone viral overnight, amassing millions of views and countless comments. Ethan threw his phone down, its screen flashing yet another headline: Celebrity Billie Eilish calls out Chef Ethan Carr for mistreatment of homeless veteran. The article that followed didn't mince words, detailing the events of the previous evening with brutal clarity. Pictures of Mike sitting with Billie, his face lined with exhaustion but his dignity intact, were everywhere. Scrolling through the comments, Ethan's chest tightened. How can someone like this run a restaurant? Disgusting. Props to Billie for standing up for what's right. Boycott Carr until this chef learns some basic humanity. He leaned back, rubbing his temples as the realization hit his reputation, carefully cultivated over years, was crumbling in real time. But mixed in with the anger was another emotion he couldn't quite name: shame. Meanwhile, across town, Mike Harper sat in a small coffee shop, a steaming cup of coffee and a pastry in front of him. For the first time in years, his stomach wasn't clenched with hunger. His phone, a battered relic, buzzed occasionally with calls and texts from numbers he didn't recognize. It was overwhelming, but Sarah had helped him set up a temporary email address to filter the offers of assistance pouring in. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts as she approached their table, carrying 2 more coffees. She'd insisted on meeting him after her shift. How are you holding up? He shrugged, his eyes lingering on the steam rising from the cup. It's a lot. I'm not used to people noticing me, let alone caring. Well, they do, Sarah said, her tone firm, and they should have all along. Mike nodded, his lips curving into a small, uncertain smile. Thanks for everything last night. You didn't have to stand up for me. Yes, I did, she replied. Someone had to. At Carr, the staff moved through the motions of lunch prep with an air of unease. The dining room was emptier than usual, and the once bustling kitchen felt oddly quiet without Ethan's sharp commands. He sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, where an open email draft flickered with an unsent apology to Billy and Mike. He tapped his fingers on the desk, the words swimming in his head but refusing to flow into coherent sentences. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you undo years of arrogance with a few words? A knock at the door startled him. Sarah stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, we need to talk." "I'm not in the mood for lectures, Sarah," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual edge. "Well, tough," she said, stepping inside and closing the door. "You need to hear this." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, go ahead." Sarah folded her arms. "You've built this place on your talent, sure, but also on fear and control. Last night people saw who you really are, and it wasn't pretty. You can't bully your way out of this one." "I didn't bully anyone," Ethan said defensively, but Sarah's sharp glare silenced him. "Then what would you call it?" she challenged. "Because it sure as hell wasn't leadership. You humiliated a man who's been through more than you can imagine, all because he didn't fit into your perfect little world." Ethan looked away, guilt clawing at his insides. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did," Sarah said softly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That evening, Ethan stepped outside the restaurant, his crisp chef's whites feeling heavier than usual. The street outside Carr was quiet, but a small group of reporters lingered across the road, hoping for a comment. He ignored them, his eyes scanning the street until he spotted the man he was looking for. "Mike," Ethan called hesitantly. Mike, sitting on a bench near the park, looked up in surprise. Billy had left town earlier that day, but she'd made sure Mike had a safe place to stay and a small fund to get him back on his feet. Still, he hadn't expected to see Ethan again. "What do you want?" Mike asked, his voice guarded. Ethan approached slowly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He looked different, less imposing, more human. "I owe you an apology. A real one." Mike arched an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. Ethan took a deep breath. "I was wrong. I let my ego and my fear of losing control get in the way of treating you like a person. I shouldn't have thrown you out, and I definitely shouldn't have humiliated you like that. I'm sorry." Mike studied him for a long moment. "Why now?" "Because last night made me realize something," Ethan admitted. "All this restaurant, the reputation, it doesn't mean anything if I can't be a decent human being." There was silence between them, heavy but not hostile. Finally, Mike nodded. "Thanks. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I appreciate you saying it." "That's fair," Ethan said quietly. "But I want to make it right. I want to do better for you and for others." Mike didn't respond immediately, but his posture relaxed slightly. "Good. Then do it." The next day, Carr's Instagram posted a picture of a new event, community table nights. Once a week, the restaurant would open its doors to those in need, offering free meals and a warm atmosphere. Ethan sat in his office, watching as the comments poured in, some skeptical, others supportive. It wasn't a fix-all, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was building something that mattered. The lights of Carr were dimmed slightly, casting a warm, inviting glow over the dining room. Tonight was different. The usual air of exclusivity had been replaced by something far more meaningful. The tables, once reserved for wealthy patrons and influencers, were now filled with an eclectic mix of people, families, veterans, single mothers, and even a few familiar faces from the nearby shelter. It was the first official community table night. Ethan Carr stood near the kitchen, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. He wasn't barking orders or scrutinizing plates tonight. Instead, he observed with quiet humility as his staff, many of whom had doubted his ability to change, moved through the dining room with smiles on their faces, serving meals to those who had never set foot in a restaurant like this before. Sarah approached, carrying 2 plates of roast chicken with all the trimmings. She paused next to Ethan, her expression softer than usual. "You know, if someone told me a month ago that you'd be doing this, I wouldn't have believed them." Ethan chuckled softly, his gaze fixed on a young boy at one of the tables who was eagerly cutting into his food. "Neither would I." Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "So what changed?" Ethan sighed, his hands dropping to his sides. "A lot of things. Mostly realizing how far I'd fallen from the kind of person I wanted to be. Seeing Mike, hearing his story, it made me face some hard truths." "Well," Sarah said, nudging him lightly with her elbow, "you're off to a good start." At one of the tables near the center of the room, Mike Harper sat with a group of other veterans. The tension that had been a constant companion for years seemed to melt away in this space, surrounded by laughter and the aroma of good food. He hadn't expected to be back here, let alone like this. Ethan approached cautiously, carrying a tray of desserts. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Mike looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "Sure." Ethan set the tray down, taking a seat across from Mike. The veterans around the table gave polite nods but mostly kept to themselves, sensing the importance of the conversation about to unfold. "I wanted to thank you for giving me another chance," Ethan began, his voice earnest. "I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Mike shrugged, his fingers brushing the edge of the table. "It's not about deserving, Ethan. It's about doing the right thing moving forward." "I'm trying," Ethan said, glancing around the room. This feels right. But I know it's just the beginning. I've got a long way to go." Mike studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You're not wrong. Change takes time. But it's a damn good start." Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. "Coming from you, that means a lot." As the evening went on, Billie Eilish's impact was still felt. Though she had left the city, her involvement had created ripples that continued to spread. News outlets had picked up the story of Carr's transformation, and community table night had become a beacon of hope for the community. Near the end of the night, Sarah stood in the middle of the dining room, holding a microphone. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" The chatter subsided as all eyes turned to her. She smiled, her cheeks flushed from excitement. "Thank you all for being here tonight. When Ethan came to us with the idea for community table night, I think I can speak for the entire staff when I say we weren't sure what to expect. But seeing this room tonight, seeing all of you, it reminds us why this matters." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah continued, "We want this to be more than just a meal. We want it to be a reminder that everyone deserves kindness, dignity, and a place to feel welcome." The room erupted into applause, and Ethan, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about Michelin stars or 5-star reviews. He was thinking about the people in this room and what it meant to them and to him. As the evening wound down, Ethan found himself alone in the dining room, wiping down a table. The staff had gone home, and the last few guests had left with full stomachs and smiles on their faces. The quiet was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos he used to thrive on. The door opened, and Mike stepped back inside. He'd left earlier but had returned, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Forgot something?" Ethan asked. Mike shook his head. "No, just wanted to say thanks for everything tonight." Ethan set the cloth down, leaning on the table. "No, Mike, thank you for giving me the chance to do this." Mike hesitated, then extended his hand. Ethan took it, their handshake firm but filled with understanding. "Take care of yourself," Mike said, heading for the door. "You too," Ethan replied, watching as the man who had unknowingly changed his life disappeared into the night. The next morning, a new sign hung in the window of Carr. It read, "Community Table Night every Wednesday. All are welcome." Ethan stood outside, looking at the sign as the city bustled around him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Billie Eilish smiled as she read the latest headline, "From arrogance to ally, how a celebrity and a veteran helped a chef find his humanity."